In 1975, a 24-year-old engineer named Steven Sasson walked into a boardroom at Kodak headquarters and showed his bosses something the world had never seen: a digital camera. 8 pounds of circuits, lenses, and magnetic tape that captured a single grainy image in 23 seconds. The executives stared at it. Then one of them asked the question that would doom an empire: why would we want to cannibalize ourselves? That camera was locked in a drawer. 40 years later, Kodak was bankrupt. Worth $31 billion in 1997. Worth less than $200 million by 2012. 145,000 employees reduced to a skeleton crew. And Rochester, New York, a city that had staked everything on the yellow and red box, was left with empty factories, slashed pensions, and a poverty rate that still hasn't recovered. This is the story of an American giant that invented the future and then buried it alive. George Eastman was born in 1854 in Waterville, New York. He never graduated, never got a degree. When his father died, 14-year-old George dropped out of school and went to work to keep his family fed. He bounced between odd jobs until he landed a clerk position at Rochester Savings Bank, pulling in about $15 a month. That should have been the ceiling for a kid like him. It wasn't. In 1877, Eastman planned a vacation to Santo Domingo, and a colleague told him to bring a camera. So he bought one. Wet plate photography in the 1870s was an absolute circus. You needed a portable darkroom the size of a tent, bottles of toxic chemicals, heavy glass plates, and the patience of a monk. The entire rig weighed as much as a small horse. Eastman never made that trip. Instead, he became consumed. Night after night, he turned his mother's kitchen into a chemistry lab, mixing emulsions, coating plates, failing, adjusting, failing again. 3 years of burned fingers and ruined batches. In 1880, he finally cracked it. A dry plate formula that actually worked. Photographers could now prepare plates in advance and develop them later. No more hauling darkroom tents into the field. But Eastman didn't stop there. Glass plates were still fragile and expensive. By 1884, he patented flexible film on a roll, something nobody had seen before. Multiple exposures on a single load. The implications were staggering. He entered a partnership with Henry A. Strong in 1880, and the Eastman Dry Plate Company was officially founded on January 1, 1881. Strong served as president. Eastman handled everything else. He hired chemist Henry Reichenbach to refine the film formula, and by 1889, they had patented nitrocellulose film, the material that would power photography and motion pictures for decades. Then came 1888, the year everything changed. You press the button, we do the rest. Eastman unveiled the first Kodak camera in 1888. A simple box, fixed focus lens on the front. No viewfinder. Just 2 V-shaped silhouettes on top to help you aim in the general direction of your subject. A rotating key on top advanced the film. A pull string set the shutter. A button released it. $25. Roughly $800 in today's money, and it came preloaded with enough film for 100 shots. Here was the genius. You didn't develop anything yourself. You shot your 100 photos, mailed the entire camera back to Rochester with $10, and Kodak did the rest. They developed the film, printed the photos, loaded a fresh roll, and shipped everything back to you. Eastman had invented more than a camera. He'd invented a business model. Sell the camera cheap. Make the real money on film and processing. The razor and blade strategy, decades before Gillette made it famous. By unburdening regular people from the nightmare of chemical development, photography stopped being an elite hobby and became something every American family could afford. The camera was an instant sensation. The name Kodak? Eastman made it up from scratch. He loved the letter K, called it a strong, incisive sort of letter. He sat down with an anagram set, played with combinations, and landed on a word that was short, impossible to mispronounce, and connected to absolutely nothing. Pure marketing instinct. On May 23, 1892, the company was officially incorporated as Eastman Kodak. 10,000 shares of stock at $100 each. The empire had a name. Eastman understood something most inventors miss. The money wasn't in hardware, it was in consumables. Film would be the engine. Cameras were just the delivery mechanism, and to dominate film, he needed a manufacturing fortress. Construction of Kodak Park began in 1890. Calling it a factory is like calling the Grand Canyon a ditch. 200 acres of industrial complex. Over 200 buildings connected by a private railroad system. Kodak built its own power plant because Rochester's electrical grid couldn't handle the load. Manufacturing photographic film required more than 50 separate steps, each one calibrated to microscopic tolerances. Mix the emulsion wrong and you destroyed entire batches worth thousands. Get the coating thickness off by a fraction and the film was useless. This complexity became Kodak's moat, and Eastman protected it like a military secret. The formula was compartmentalized. Only a handful of senior chemists knew the complete process. The worker mixing emulsion in Building 12 had no clue what happened in Building 23. New hires signed confidentiality agreements that lasted until death. Not until they quit. Until death. Guards patrolled around the clock. Cameras, ironically, were forbidden inside restricted areas. Visitors needed special clearance. Taking notes was grounds for removal. But Eastman didn't build loyalty through fear alone. He built it through generosity. In 1910, he established a welfare fund, providing workmen's compensation. In 1912, he launched a profit-sharing program for every employee. In 1919, he sold a massive portion of his personal stock to workers below market value. By 1922, Kodak was the second-largest purchaser of silver in the United States, behind only the U.S. Treasury. By 1928, the company offered life insurance, disability benefits, and retirement annuities. The annual wage dividend, a bonus for all workers, typically hit 15% of base salary. Starting wages ran 30 to 40% above comparable manufacturing jobs. The deal was simple. Stay loyal, and Kodak takes care of you for life. And for generations, they delivered. Turnover in the 1950s was just 13%. The national average for manufacturers, 50%. Entire families, 3-4 generations deep, built their lives around Kodak employment. Grandfather retired from Building 65. Dad ran quality control. Son started on the assembly line. Granddaughter joined as a chemist. A 1989 New York Times article called Rochester a company town. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was an understatement. For 7 decades, from the early 1900s through the mid-1970s, Kodak didn't just lead the photography industry. It was the photography industry. Market share numbers that would make today's tech monopolies jealous. In the United States, Kodak controlled somewhere between 80 and 90% of all film sales. Globally, north of 70%. When people said film, they meant Kodak. The same way people say Kleenex instead of tissue. The Brownie camera, first released in 1900 and marketed directly to children, cracked open the amateur photography market like a sledgehammer. Then, Thomas Edison and the Motion Picture Patents Company came calling in 1908, and Eastman negotiated for Kodak to be the sole supplier of film to the entire motion picture industry. Hollywood literally ran on Kodak film. Annual sales crossed $1 billion in 1962, hit $2 billion by 1966. The workforce doubled between 1936 and 1966, with the majority concentrated in Rochester. Over 60,000 people clocked in at Kodak facilities every single day in that one city. Worldwide employment peaked at around 145,000. That's more people than lived in most American cities. The Instamatic cameras, launched in 1963, became the company's cheapest cameras ever, putting Kodak into virtually every household in America. The phrase Kodak moment entered the English language. It meant something worth remembering, something worth preserving. Rochester absorbed every ripple of this success. Population exploded from about 162,000 in 1900 to 332,000 by 1950. Kodak funded hospitals, donated millions to schools, built public parks. George Eastman personally bankrolled the Eastman Theater and poured tens of millions into the University of Rochester. The Eastman School of Music became one of the finest conservatories in America. On July 18, 1930, Kodak joined the Dow Jones Industrial Average, a marker of blue-chip permanence. The company's business model barely changed from the 1930s through the 1970s because it didn't need to. No mergers. No acquisitions that might bring fresh perspectives. Why fix what's printing money? But empires built on stasis have a fatal flaw. They forget that the world keeps moving, even when they don't. This is where the story turns from triumph to tragedy. And it starts with one man walking into a lab. Steven Sasson was 24 years old when he joined Kodak's research division in 1973. Fresh out of grad school. Eager. A year into the job, his supervisor handed him an odd assignment. Do something interesting with this CCD chip. CCD, charge-coupled device. Cutting-edge semiconductor technology that could convert light into electrical signals. Most people at Kodak saw it as a curiosity. Sasson saw a revolution. He disappeared into the lab and started building. December 1975. Sasson emerged with a contraption that weighed 8 pounds and looked like a toaster with a lens. It captured images at 0.01 megapixels. 10,000 pixels total. Your smartphone today packs 12 million or more. Taking a single photograph required 23 seconds of exposure. The image was stored on a cassette tape. To see what you'd shot, you plugged the whole apparatus into a television set. Crude, clunky, primitive, and also the most important invention in the history of photography since Eastman's roll film. Sasson presented it to Kodak's senior management. Picture this: a kid barely into his career, standing before executives who'd spent decades building fortunes on film chemistry. He showed them the camera, explained the technology, walked through what it meant for the future. Their response was devastating. That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it. Kodak's leadership looked at the first digital camera ever built, and their instinct, their first gut-level reaction, was to bury it. The math explained why. 85% of Kodak's profits came from film, and the chemicals required to develop it. Digital photography eliminated film entirely. Management saw Sasson's device not as an opportunity, but as a bomb, strapped to their $10 billion business model. Why would we want to cannibalize ourselves? Another employee, Larry Madison, wrote an internal report in 1979 predicting that a complete shift to digital photography would occur by approximately 2010. He was almost exactly right. But the executives who read that report convinced themselves of 4 comfortable lies. 1. Customers would always prefer physical prints. 2. Digital technology was prohibitively expensive and would stay that way. 3. Digital image quality would never match film. 4. Even if digital caught on, they had 10 to 20 years before it mattered. Every single assumption was catastrophically wrong. Kodak filed patents on Sasson's invention to protect the intellectual property. Then they shelved it. Digital research received less than 5% of the R&D budget. The vast majority of resources went into incremental improvements to film faster emulsions, finer grain, better color saturation. Kodak kept perfecting a technology the world was about to abandon. The corporate culture reinforced the delusion at every level. Film engineers got promoted. Digital researchers were sidelined. Success at Kodak meant protecting the core business, never disrupting it. Innovation, the very thing that had built the company, became the enemy. Under CEOs Colby Chandler and Kay Whitmore, Kodak tried to diversify through chemistry instead. They acquired Sterling Drug in 1988 for $5.1 billion. The pharmaceutical company was overvalued, hemorrhaged money, and was sold off just 6 years later. They tried entering the information systems market, buying Unix developer Interactive Systems Corporation. That was sold off too. Every diversification attempt failed, because Kodak's culture couldn't absorb anything foreign. Here's the tragedy that keeps business professors awake at night. Kodak had everything it needed to dominate digital photography. The patents, the engineering talent, the manufacturing infrastructure, the distribution networks, the most recognized brand name in imaging on Earth. They held the future in their hands in 1975 and chose to bury it. Not because they lacked capability, because they lacked courage. While Kodak was busy burying its own invention, a competitor was sharpening knives in Tokyo. Fujifilm entered the American market in the 1980s with film that matched Kodak's quality, some said surpassed it, at prices 20 to 30% cheaper. Then came 1984, the Los Angeles Olympics. Kodak should have owned that sponsorship, photography's biggest name, on American soil, at the world's biggest sporting event. Instead, Fuji outbid them and became the official film of the games. Fuji's green logo was plastered across every venue while billions watched worldwide. It was a humiliation that gave Fuji a permanent foothold in the US market. Kodak's response? They didn't innovate harder. They didn't cut prices. They cried foul, filed a petition with the US Commerce Department under Section 301, accusing Fuji of unfair trade practices in Japan. The complaint went all the way to the World Trade Organization. On January 30, 1998, the WTO delivered a sweeping rejection of Kodak's case. While Kodak was filing paperwork, Fuji was opening a film plant on American soil and clawing market share from 10% in the early 1990s to 17% by 1997. A price war erupted that year and gutted Kodak's margins. Revenue dropped from $15.97 billion in 1996 to $14.36 billion in 1997, a fall of more than 10% in a single year. Net earnings collapsed from $1.29 billion to just $5 million. Kodak's U.S. market share fell from 80.1% to 74.7%, 5 percentage points gone in 12 months. Under CEO George Fisher, a former Motorola executive brought in to save the company, Kodak's annual revenue peaked at $16 billion in 1996, and profits peaked at $2.5 billion in 1999. Those numbers looked impressive. They were a mirage. The film market was about to fall off a cliff, and Fuji, unlike Kodak, was already diversifying into chemicals, healthcare, and cosmetics. When film finally died, Fuji survived. Kodak didn't. By 2001, film sales started falling. Not wobbling, falling. And they never came back. Under CEO Daniel Karp, Kodak finally made its aggressive play for digital. The EasyShare line of digital cameras was user-friendly, affordable, and marketed hard. By 2005, Kodak ranked #1 in U.S. digital camera sales, surging 40% to $5.7 billion. Sounds like a comeback story, right? It wasn't. Digital cameras had razor-thin profit margins. Asian competitors, Canon, Sony, Nikon, could manufacture cheaper and faster. Kodak was selling many cameras at a loss just to maintain market share. Meanwhile, the film business, where Kodak actually made money, kept hemorrhaging. It was like bailing water with a thimble while the hull was splitting open. By 2007, Kodak had dropped to 4th in U.S. digital camera sales with a 9.6% share. By 2010, 7th place, 7%, behind Canon, Sony, Nikon, and companies that hadn't even existed when Sasson built his prototype. Then came the real extinction event: camera phones. Nokia and Samsung started embedding decent lenses into mobile phones around 2005. Then, Apple launched the iPhone in 2007. Instagram followed in 2010. Suddenly, dedicated digital cameras weren't just competing with each other. They were competing with the device already in your pocket. Digital camera sales peaked in 2007 and fell every year after. The very market Kodak had bet the company on was dying almost as fast as film had. Kodak had no smartphone technology, no mobile software, no ecosystem. The EasyShare cameras looked like relics from another century. The company began hemorrhaging people. Between 2004 and 2007, Kodak closed 13 film manufacturing plants and 130 photo finishing facilities. 50,000 employees lost their jobs. In 2009, they killed Kodachrome. 74 years of production ended as sales had collapsed. The stock price, which had touched $90 in the 1990s, fell below $2. Revenue cratered. Cash reserves drained. The company was circling the drain, and everyone on Wall Street knew it. January 19, 2012. Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York. An American industrial titan, a company that had been on the Dow Jones Industrial Average since 1930, that had employed more workers than most American cities had residents, was broke. The numbers were staggering: $675 billion in debt against $5.1 billion in assets. Global employment had collapsed to 17,000. In Rochester, roughly 500 workers remained from a peak of 60,000. Market capitalization sat below $200 million. 15 years earlier, Kodak had been worth $31 billion. The company had lost over 99% of its value. Citigroup provided a $950 million credit facility to keep the lights on during restructuring. Kodak secured an 18-month window to produce a reorganization plan. The fire sale began immediately. The patent portfolio, decades of imaging research, including those original digital camera patents from 1975, was auctioned to a consortium that included Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Samsung for $525 million. The companies that killed Kodak's business bought the inventions that could have made Kodak one of them. Let that irony settle for a moment. The consumer camera division was killed entirely. EasyShare, gone. Digital picture frames, gone. Inkjet printers, a business CEO, Antonio Perez, had spent hundreds of millions building, gone. As part of a settlement with the UK-based Kodak pension plan, the company spun off its remaining photographic film, scanners, and kiosk operations into a new entity called Kodak Alaris, headquartered in Hertfordshire, England. The cruelest blow landed on retirees. 56,000 former employees who had spent entire careers at Kodak, people who had been promised lifetime pensions, faced massive benefit cuts. Some lost 30 to 40% of their retirement income overnight. Workers in their 70s and 80s who had planned their lives around those pensions found themselves applying for jobs at grocery stores. On September 3, 2013, Kodak emerged from bankruptcy. A drastically smaller company focused on commercial printing, packaging, and specialty film. Global employment stood at roughly 8,000. The consumer photography empire that George Eastman built was dead. Rochester didn't just lose a company. It lost its identity. For over a century, Rochester meant Kodak. The company had shaped the city's economy, its culture, its self-image. Politicians courted Kodak executives. The school calendar accommodated factory shifts. Local businesses oriented their entire operations around Kodak's payday schedule. You couldn't separate the two. They were one organism. When that organism died, the city nearly died with it. Between 2007 and 2018, the real GDP losses caused by Kodak's decline canceled out all growth in every other sector in Rochester. That's not a statistic you skim past. Every dollar earned by every other business in the region, hospitals, universities, tech startups, restaurants, was negated by the Kodak-sized crater in the local economy. Population told the story in raw numbers. 332,000 in 1950, down to about 210,000 by 2012, still declining. Unemployment spiked to 9 or 10%, well above national averages. When you counted indirect job losses, suppliers, service companies, related industries, over 50,000 positions vanished from the regional economy. Housing prices collapsed. Who wants to buy a home in a city losing its foundation? Neighborhoods that had been solidly middle class emptied out. Homes sat abandoned, windows boarded, lawns gone to seed. Small businesses that had served Kodak workers for generations closed their doors. The restaurant where engineers grabbed lunch. The dry cleaner near the plant gates. Gone. Each closure triggered more job losses, more contraction. A death spiral feeding on itself. Schools faced devastating cuts as property tax revenue collapsed. Class sizes ballooned. Programs were eliminated. The city government hemorrhaged revenue, forcing cuts to police, fire, and infrastructure, right when the community needed them most. Kodak Park itself became a monument to decline. In 2013, most of the complex was sold to developers and rebranded as Eastman Business Park. About 50 to 60 small companies moved in: tech startups, logistics outfits, light manufacturers. They occupy maybe a third of the space. The rest sits empty. You can walk through vast parking lots that once overflowed with workers, cars, and see a few dozen vehicles scattered across acres of cracked asphalt. The abandoned sections draw urban explorers who document the decay and post it online. Someone spray-painted on one wall, "Kodak died here." Kodak Park sits alongside Detroit's abandoned auto plants and Pittsburgh's dead steel mills in the gallery of American industrial ruin. The environmental legacy persists, too. In 1994, the EPA designated Kodak Park a Superfund site, a label reserved for the most dangerously polluted locations in the country. Manufacturing film had generated millions of gallons of contaminated wastewater annually. Decades of dumping toxic chemicals. Silver nitrate, methylene chloride, cadmium, lead, volatile organic compounds had poisoned the Genesee River, contaminated groundwater, and left hotspots of severe soil contamination across the property. Fish pulled from the river near Kodak Park remain unsafe to eat today. Cleanup has cost hundreds of millions of dollars and is still ongoing. The company that promised to help people preserve beautiful memories left behind a landscape poisoned for generations. Kodak still exists. Technically, the company employs roughly 400-500 people globally. Revenue sits around $1.2 billion, a fraction of the $16 billion it pulled in at its peak. They focus on commercial digital printing, packaging solutions, and specialty film. Hollywood directors like Christopher Nolan and Quentin Tarantino still shoot on Kodak motion picture film, and in 2015 and 2020, the company signed new supply agreements with major studios. Kodak remains the last major manufacturer of motion picture film stock after Fuji stopped production in 2013. There's a small irony worth noting. Film photography has experienced a minor renaissance among younger hobbyists. In 2022, Kodak announced it was hiring new film technicians to meet revived demand. But let's be honest, this is a boutique market, a nostalgia-driven hobby. It can't support 60,000 workers or rebuild a city's economy. It's vinyl records in the streaming age. Cool, not commercially significant. The brand itself has been licensed out like a fading celebrity selling endorsement deals. JK Imaging makes PIX-PRO digital cameras under the Kodak name. The Bullet Group launched the Kodak Ektra smartphone in 2016. Arcos sold Kodak-branded tablets in 2017. They even tried cryptocurrency, Kodak Coin, and a Bitcoin mining machine called the Kodak Cash Miner. Both failed. The company that once defined innovation now rents out its name to other people's products. Rochester is trying to reinvent itself. The University of Rochester is now the region's largest employer. A small startup scene has emerged around optics and photonics, building on the city's imaging legacy. Downtown has seen some redevelopment, restaurants, converted lofts, small business growth. But the city struggles with high poverty rates, underfunded schools, brain drain, and a population that keeps declining. The people Rochester needs most to rebuild are the ones leaving fastest. George Eastman's personal philanthropy survives as his most durable contribution. The Eastman Theater still operates as a premier performing arts venue. The Eastman School of Music remains one of America's finest conservatories. He endowed them so heavily that they became independent of the company that funded them. They're proof that Eastman genuinely cared about something beyond quarterly profits, a quality that most of his successors conspicuously lacked. So what do we take from this? Kodak isn't just a business failure. It's a blueprint for how dominant companies destroy themselves. And the lessons are as sharp as the letter K that George Eastman loved so much. Lesson 1. If you invent the future, don't bury it, because it threatens the present. Kodak built the first digital camera in 1975. They had the patents, the talent, the brand, the distribution, and 35 years of runway before digital went mainstream. They could have owned the transition. Instead, they protected quarterly profits and watched Sony, Canon, and Nikon seize the market they created. The technical term is the innovator's dilemma, when successful companies fail because they're too afraid to disrupt their own cash cow. Kodak is the textbook case, the fatal case. Lesson 2. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Kodak's corporate DNA was film. Film engineers got promoted. Digital researchers were second-class citizens. Risk aversion was rewarded. Bureaucracy strangled every attempt to pivot. The company's leaders had spent entire careers perfecting film chemistry. Psychologically, they couldn't accept that their life's work was becoming obsolete. When the data screamed change, the culture whispered stay. Lesson 3. Diversification only works if you actually commit to it. Kodak tried to diversify half a dozen times: chemicals, pharmaceuticals, information systems, printers. Every attempt was half-hearted, underfunded, or disconnected from the company's core strengths. Sterling Drug was a $5 billion mistake. The inkjet printer business burned hundreds of millions trying to compete with Hewlett-Packard in a market already drowning in competition. Fujifilm diversified successfully into healthcare, cosmetics, and advanced materials. Same threat, different outcome, because Fuji actually committed. Lesson 4. No company is too big to fail, and no city should bet its existence on one employer. Rochester made Kodak its entire identity. When Kodak fell, Rochester had no backup plan. 60,000 jobs evaporated. The tax base collapsed. Schools crumbled. Neighborhoods emptied. The devastation wasn't just economic, it was psychological. A city that had believed in permanent stability learned the hardest possible way that nothing is permanent. George Eastman built one of the greatest companies in American history by refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they were. He looked at wet plate photography and said there has to be a better way. He disrupted an entire industry. And then the company he built became the very thing he had disrupted. Bloated, complacent, terrified of change, Kodak didn't die because it lacked resources or talent. It died because it stopped being what made it great in the first place. Steven Sasson's invention, buried in a drawer in 1975, eventually rose from the grave and destroyed the company that created it. The executives who killed it thought they were protecting an empire. They were signing its death warrant. Kodak went from a $31 billion icon to a $1 billion footnote, from 145,000 employees to 4,500. From a name that defined American photography to a cautionary tale taught in every business school on earth. The factories stand empty. The pensions were slashed. The city is still trying to rebuild. And somewhere in Building 9 of what used to be Kodak Park, the room where Sasson built that first digital camera, pigeons roost where million-dollar equipment once hummed. If walls could feel irony, that building would be screaming. Kodak invented the future, then buried it, then was buried by it. Innovate or die. There is no third option.